Welcome everyone. Hi there, and welcome to our webinar on ensuring excellence, navigating compliance in medical affairs. We're so glad to have you joining us from all over the world. As usual, I see a few people already in the chat letting us know where they are joining from. But to get things started, if you haven't already, please take a moment in the chat and tell us where you're joining from today. We love to see the global reach of the pharmaceutical industry and our attendees that we have in our webinars. While you're inputting in the chat, we'll just give everyone a minute or two to join in, then we'll officially get started. I see India and Switzerland. We have both West Coast and East Coast US already here. Alrighty, fantastic. We see attendees from, again, India, everywhere around the globe. Seems like we have a global reach. For those of you who are new to the ACMA, we at the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, we have a mission. And that is to establish a higher level of global independent standards of excellence across the board throughout the entire pharmaceutical environment. And we do that by having important conversations and discussions through webinars like these with industry leaders. I'm Kiana Dixon, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on compliance. Compliance is absolutely crucial in the pharmaceutical industry, and it's an area where staying informed is very key. It's very important, and that's why we put together this webinar to explore the best practices within medical affairs specifically, and to address some challenges that you might be facing with the insights of our esteemed speakers today. So joining me today are two fantastic speakers who bring a wealth of experience to the table. First, we have Heather Brown. She is the Vice President of Compliance Operations at MedCompli. Heather is a former compliance officer with a proven track record in the industry. When she's not sailing during her time off in Florida, Heather is a certified corporate healthcare compliance professional who's known for building strong relationships and providing strategic solutions to minimize risk and maintain compliance within the industry. Now today, Heather, she will dive into solutions for compliance, and she'll discuss how she even leveraged the MedCompli platform in a prior role, which really gives her a unique perspective on its efficiency and its effectiveness as a solution. Alongside Heather, we're honored to have Dr. Sotirios Stergiopoulos, the President and CEO of ATA Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Stergiopoulos is a highly regarded physician executive with extensive expertise in the biotech space. His career path is impressive, from leading roles in oncology R&D at major companies like Bayer and Celgene to his current role, again, as founder and chairman of the board at ATA Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Stergiopoulos is also passionate about mentoring future generations, serving as a mentor and a board of governor with the ACMA. Now, let's go ahead and dive into the agenda for today. Heather, she will first cover recent settlements in the pharmaceutical industry and how remaining compliant and avoiding settlements in the future. She will also cover considerations you must keep in mind during the stages of HCP engagement, from screening and identification of stakeholders to documentation of those interactions. And then Dr. Stergiopoulos will dive into the challenges and solutions of how to best support a compliant medical affairs team with education and training. We'll also have time for question and answer at the end of the webinar, so feel free to jot down any questions that you may have throughout today's presentation, and you can submit them in the chat, and we'll address them as time allows at the end. Now, I'm confident that this discussion will provide valuable insights to help you navigate compliance in medical affairs. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll pass the buck over to Heather Brown.
Thanks, Kiana. As Kiana said, I am Vice President of Compliance Operations at MedCompli, but I am also a former compliance officer. So I have dealt with these challenges firsthand in quite a few roles, actually. And I actually used MedCompli in my prior role so that we really automated this whole engagement process for the entire department and the entire company. So I think I do bring kind of a unique perspective from being on both sides of the screen. So thanks for joining us today. So I think we're going to go ahead and hit that slide, Kiana, for me. So why are we here? What is the importance of compliance? So I would say overall, compliance helps your organizations meet industry guidelines and it improves patient care. It also helps ensure that products are safe and effective, that patients have confidence in the medication and medical devices that they're taking and using. It can help identify, fix problems before they negatively impact the organization, whether that impact is from a regulatory perspective, sanctions, or whether that's reputational harm. And I think you take an Enron or an Arthur Andersen and you think about the negative connotations with those organizations. As a patient, are you going to be comfortable using a product manufactured by either? Go ahead for the next slide, Kiana. As you're probably aware, we do live in a highly regulated industry. And I think it's important that you understand that regulatory landscape. So today we're going to kind of cover issues as they relate to the Sunshine Act, the anti-kickback statute, false claims, which oftentimes runs kind of parallel to the anti-kickback statute, and then also some guidelines from the FDA. It's also important that we adhere to these industry codes. So whether or not you belong to AdvaMed on the med device side or pharma on the pharma side, I would highly encourage you to either download the AdvaMed app or review pharma's code on interactions with healthcare professionals. They really do provide kind of a wealth of information, of industry standards, codes of conduct. And if you are familiar with them, but it's been a little while, I really suggest you revisit those. Go ahead to the next. So I'm going to start with a recent settlement and you'll see how this kind of relates to the program as we move forward. But some of you may have already read this. If you have not seen this settlement, it's a very interesting kind of case study in what can go wrong when you're not doing things compliantly and you're not engaging HCPs appropriately. So this is a $678 million settlement where the government alleged, and since the settlement is signed, apparently there was some truth to it, that Novartis was operating sham speaker programs. So they were having dinners at some of the most high-end restaurants in the country. Think Nobu, Le Bernardin, Gramercy Tavern, those big names that you hear, for your fancy dinners. One of these dinners at Ruth's Chris, where they had engaged a speaker, had one physician in the audience, and the cost per person was $448. As the government was investigating, they found that within the investigation period, 12,000 of the events that were held in that time period exceeded Novartis's internal meal limit of $125. In addition to that fine, they entered into a corporate integrity agreement whereby they can only host virtual events. As a result, the OIG has issued a special fraud alert whereby they identified that, now they mentioned speaker programs, but they've been very clear that this is pretty much any interaction as it relates to an HCP. And the timing of this was very interesting because it was issued smack dab in the middle of COVID. And if you recall, interactions among HCPs really changed during that time. So things moved virtual, and it proved to the government that things could be done virtually, whereby there doesn't need to be a transfer of value. So if you are doing and you are interacting in person, I would highly recommend you take a look at this, because they have specifically stated that they're going to be looking at some certain characteristics of programs. So a program where there is not much substantive information, if there's alcohol available, and if there is alcohol provided at no cost, it will become under greater scrutiny. The program is held at a location conducive to educational exchange, and that there are not a large number of programs on the same topic, product information. If your indication hasn't changed in quite some time and you don't have additional clinical data, they're going to be looking at that under greater scrutiny. And as well, you're going to want to interact with your, the HCPs as needed and not frequently on the same topic. They're also going to look at how much influence that your sales and marketing team has in the selection and usage of your HCPs. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of talk about the process of identifying, screening, and engaging HCPs. And this is regardless of how you're going to use them downstream. This process really should be followed in order to ensure that you're engaging in a compliant manner. So when you are identifying these HCPs, how are you developing the criteria for an appropriate HCP for the engagement or for the initiative? Who's involved in that development? How are you selecting them? Who is involved in that selection process? And once you've developed that criteria and determined who's going to be involved in the process, who's ensuring that once the criteria are there, they're applied uniformly? You can go ahead, Kiana. So that second step in the process is really the screening. So healthcare organizations in the United States that participate in those federally funded programs like Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE are required to routinely screen for individuals and entities who are prohibited from participating in those programs. And those debarments can happen for a variety of reasons, but that list is updated every 30 days. And so in 2013, the OIG decided that that would be its industry guideline, that not only should you be screening initially prior to the engagement, but then every 30 days thereafter, and that should be an individual and an entity, at the individual and entity level. Go ahead, Kiana. So you've identified the HCP, you've screened them to ensure that they're not prohibited from participating in governmental programs. You're going to calculate your fair market value. So the government wants to ensure that the price paid to those in a position to refer business represents the actual value of such services and not the value of the referrals. So some questions you should be asking: how are you determining your FMV? Are you using an outside organization? If you're using an outside organization to provide those rates, where are they getting? What is the source of their rates? What is the methodology behind your credentialing? How are you determining which, who is a KOL tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or who is a tier 1, tier 2, tier 4? What are the data elements that are important to you when you do that? And that can vary by organization, right? Some organizations might value academic experience a little higher than, let's say, community practice experience. But you really want to be, asking those questions, ensuring obviously that you're not, considering the volume or the value of the business. And then exceptions. There's always going to be exceptions to fair market value. So how do you determine when it's appropriate to do a fair market value exception? Do you have that documented? Do you have multiple approvals? Best practice, I would say, you have more than one department determining that an exception to the fair market value is appropriate, and that you've documented why you feel it is appropriate and what the legitimate business need that no other HCP could meet without extending an FMV that is outside of the regular rate. Go ahead, Kiana. I started to say it, document, document, document. And I really do believe that documentation is absolutely the key to remaining compliant, because even if you have, and when I say audit or investigation, I don't mean just external, because you really should be doing this at the department level. And then, your compliance department might be doing it as well internally. And then you might have if you're a public company, you might have an audit done regularly. So it is so important to be able to produce easily that documentation behind the justification or the rationale of the engagements. Even if they don't agree with the rationale or the conclusion that you came to or the action that was taken, if you have the documentation that you had completed, the business need, you've done the FMV credentialing, and here is the background on this, you have the agreement, it can be quite a mitigating factor, but it can also be a great fact pattern to say, look, this is why we did what we did. And it is a lot easier to justify things than if you see it on face value when you have that documentation. Go ahead, Kiana. So the next step, I would say, once you've done that FMV, is the contract. This is certainly going to tie more into your legal department, but when you are reading the contract, you're going to want to make sure that it is clear, that it has, most importantly, the clauses for non-adherence for compliance. So whether that is a clause that includes, that means retraining, or whether you then have the ability to terminate a contract based upon non-compliance. Those are very important clauses to have to demonstrate the commitment to compliance at the HCP engagement level. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on this, obviously, because we're going to spend the second half of the program on training, but I will mention the importance of not only training at the HCP level once you've engaged them in a compliant manner, but the importance of training at the employee level. And this can be done, by the Med Affairs department, by the compliance department. Compliance is everybody's responsibility. We hear that all the time. But when you own a program, you understand the intricacies of the program, and you understand where the potential risks might be. And so you are probably the best person to train on that. Go ahead, Kiana. So we've done all of this. We've established the legitimate need. We've screened against the, appropriate lists. We've credentialed the HCPs. We have an agreement. Now what? Monitoring and auditing is so important. And I say this again, as I said in the training, compliance one is everybody's responsibility. But when you own that program, you understand the intricacies. You are the ones that can ensure that you're following the methodology to determine who an appropriate, HCP is, that you're following the methodology on credentialing for an FMV rate. What I would say as well is this findings from these, this monitoring that doesn't always, and this is extremely important, that it doesn't and shouldn't always need to be a disciplinary action. So in a culture of transparency, I really feel that these findings are more, opportunities for learning Now, obviously, if there's something extremely egregious, then, then that might be a different answer. But it really, if one person is having an issue with something, the chances are there's going to be another one having an issue with it. Or if one person has a question on something, chances are somebody else has an issue with it. So that culture of transparency, open doors, being able to come to somebody and ask questions is very, very important. Next slide, please. So this is a high-level overview of kind of what I see as a compliant process of engaging HCPs. So in this case, I have Med Affairs, compliance, the HCP, and legal. Those swim lanes might look a little different in your organization, but the activities should be pretty similar, whether they're in a different order, it doesn't matter. But you see how through the stages of this engagement, from the beginning to the sunshine reporting, that we are touching on each aspects of regulations to ensure that we're checking these boxes. And when they become part of your process, it really makes it a lot easier to be comfortable that you're doing things compliantly. So here we're starting with that, legitimate business need. And then we're sending a questionnaire to the HCP. HCP completes it, we screen, goes back to Med Affairs for that credentialing. Maybe it needs a compliance approval along the way. And then legal jumps in for the contract. Maybe it goes back to Med Affairs to, back and forth with the HCP. Then you have the contract. Does that then look like a service request that needs another set of eyes? Or, these are all things to think about. Like I said, this is kind of what I look at as the somewhat ideal process flow, regardless of who the parties are that are involved in that. And then it runs through the activity, and then at the very end, the transparency reporting. So we really have covered the aspects of the anti-kickback statute, which then if you've covered those, you're pretty safe with the False Claims Act as well. And then also, transparency at the sunshine level. Next slide, please, Kiana. So what are the biggest challenges? And I think these, these sound pretty obvious, but I think that they are challenges that we all run across. And number one is time. And that's, nobody has enough time in the day. Most people wear multiple hats. But that's where collaboration, I think, between parties and departments becomes so important. So, we saw in that process flow that the engagement process often involves multiple, and should involve multiple departments. And those departments might have competing priorities, right? The business Med Affairs might be concerned with, launching a new initiative, but legal is in the midst of, implementing a new contract management system, let's say. So, they might want to wait to get that contract out until the system is, fully implemented, and that's causing a delay on the Med Affairs process side. So that collaboration and communication between department really is really so very important, but it's also essential to show that you're aligned with regulations and your own company policies across departments. And then manual processes. I think anytime there's a manual process in place, first of all, you have a greater opportunity for errors, loss of documentation, etc. But then it contributes to the issue of time. So if we can automate these processes, I think we end up with cleaner, more compliant processes that also kind of assist in that collaboration and time management. Next slide, Kiana. So how do we overcome these challenges? Well, education and training is one. And again, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, but also technology and compliance. We at MedCompli, do offer a compliance solution that allows this process of engagement to happen whereby you're ensuring you're checking those boxes. It's automated, it's cross-department functional, and it's compliant. Next slide. As I finish, I think it's important to note that obviously this was a US-centric presentation, that when you are conducting business globally, that it's important to keep in mind the regulations that might apply in various regions, in various countries, in various localities. Some countries require a different step-by-step engagement process, like France, for example. You might need to collect different information, or disclose things in Colombia than you would in the United States. So it's important to know where you do business, which seems like an obvious question, but you'd be surprised. And also know that within the US, that states are increasingly looking at engagements of HCPs, and not just on the commercial side. So you're going to want to make sure, again, that goes to communication, collaboration with the departments, knowing where you do business, knowing what the requirements are there to ensure that you're doing things in a compliant manner. Next slide. And this is my last, I want to emphasize, I think, I feel that by implementing these processes surrounding your engagement process really does demonstrate that commitment, the organization's commitment to compliance. And when an organization is compliant, that ultimately contributes to patient safety. So thanks for joining. I will turn it over to Sotirios. And hope that I didn't murder your name again.
No. It's you made me notorious to be superior. So thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate that. And I think one of the clear messages that we have here is that if you don't have a Heather in your organization, you better find one. And that's really because there is so much that has changed over the years. And sometimes when I see all these, I would say, different regulations and worries about compliance, it makes me feel a little bit like a dinosaur in this field, because for years, we started many moons ago, before the Sunshine Act. There was really not much of an understanding of all these legal and compliant manners of working. We grew up in a different world and setting. It wasn't just taking someone to dinner for a $400 a plate dinner. There were companies taking physicians with their families and going to different meetings in South America, and leaving the US. So we're talking about a whole different world than many of us have actually known from the past. But as we go into this a little bit more, there's a couple of aspects that I think are very, very important. And as we go to the next slide, Kiana, you look at what's really the reason. There's a lot of risk on what's out there, right? You put yourself through a lot of vulnerabilities. Not doing the compliant thing. For once, years ago, it wasn't really a great picture about what meant to be compliant. We were always given a sort of background of, check to see if this is compliant, and we'd go to our legal partners, and they would try and figure out, based on the rules of the governing bodies, whether we were doing something in a compliant manner. When you look at something that was brought up before about fair market value, we didn't even know what fair market value was. And when we finally understood it, it was then broken up into tiers. And then how do you place a KOL from back then into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? So we really ran in a world of not knowing what we didn't know. And many times that left us vulnerable. It left us really at a point where, we seemed to be doing the wrong thing. It gave the industry a very bad name in a way that, look what these guys are doing. They're compromising their integrity. They're not doing the right things as per the legal framework that was supposedly out there. But in essence, we just didn't know. And when you were hired to go into a company, some of the easier ways to go in were through either safety or even potentially medical affairs, because there wasn't a real need for specific aspects like this. It was thought that you can always ask questions, but then I refer to what I said before. We didn't know what we didn't know, and it left us in a real shambles at one point until we had to realize that some things had to happen. Number one, we had to have people that understood compliance, right? Were there to be able to say that this is what you can or you cannot do. But what's also beneficial is, how do we have our own people within the company understand that there are limits? And that wasn't always done in an effective way. So go to the next slide. We had to start thinking about, ways of getting to a point where we felt comfortable working in the environment that we're in. Some companies, they enforced more of a strict review process, or they formed committees that would allow for better review. There were teams that were actually built up to give you a sense of, I would say, uh, that there was control within the company. There were policies and procedures put into place, but the one area that still lacked was education and training. And it appeared to be such an absolute need because, as many of you probably have heard, you know, there needs to be a standard. There needs to be an understanding of what you're doing in the field that you're in. Many of us went into the industry because of being specific experts in the field that we are, part of, in whether it was in academia or whatnot. And we were hired for that, but we went into a world that just didn't have a good set of providing standards and knowledge and education about what we need to do now that we're in this field. Go next slide, please, Kiara. Kiara, sorry. So, there had to be some sort of understanding of, can there be some sort of training program? Is there something that can be done? And, many of us realized that industry was much more complex than just going in there, flexing some academic muscle and getting the job done and feeling like we contributed to something. There was so much more. And unfortunately, the standard from company to company was really based on how much interest they had in actually teaching people and educating them appropriately. Now, as Heather mentioned before, you make a $687 million mistake, you learn that you better actually take care of the education component within your organization, because it's costly. It's costly to make these sort of mistakes. It's costly to become a company that's perceived as untrustworthy in the industry. Not only the industry, you have governments, you have organizations that belong to all these patient-related situations. And if you come off as a group that is just not doing the right thing, it's a problem. So depending on whether a company had what's called the CIA that was mentioned before by Heather or not, would also depend on the level of education and training. But you can imagine that at this point, we're talking about a very scattered approach to, what sort of education and training there will be depending on the company. So the more burnt company would probably have a better educational program and training versus a company that sort of coasted through, had no issues, and figured, well, fine, don't worry, we never had a CIA, we're doing good. So an organization like the CMA actually came at probably the most opportune time, and really started setting a real standard about what needs to get done out there. And, when you go through this sort of training and people see that you have a certification or you're certified in something, it really matters, because now all of a sudden people know that you have at least a level of understanding. You are trained to make sure that you follow certain guidelines and rules, and also that you are not a risk and liability as you come into their company, or if you're an employee of the company, that you would actually be trained appropriately to make sure that they don't have to worry as much. So really the ACMA at that time came in at a perfect opportunity, and really just I think was a trendsetter to allow people to get to that level. And don't forget, the more you're actually certified in this, you become a valuable asset to a company. So you become hireable, number one. You become retainable, number two. And I think these are very, very important matters to remember. Can we go to the next slide? So, as I mentioned before, getting that BCMAS, certification carries a lot of weight. Now, I could tell you personally, I was chief medical officer of a company, multinational company, that I brought that within house. I had I would say more than 80% of a more than 370, 380 medical affairs organization get certified. And I think it's only benefited the company, number one, but also when people decide to leave a company and go somewhere else, having that certification brought them to a different level and allowed them to be, as I mentioned before, quite hireable. But because as someone that's been a manager and hired people into an organization, and currently even as CEO of a small biotech company, you want to make sure that people understand what are the absolute necessities to go into this field and not bring danger not only to yourself but also to the organization. It's very, very important. So getting that certification, bringing that standard of learning and training has been absolute key in our industry. Next slide. So, when you think about it, having an organization like the ACMA has been nothing but valuable. I mean, I've been on the board now for 6, 7 years, and for me, it's absolutely, something that uh, I would never think twice about it. It's one where the money that went into the training for all our people has paid itself off in so many ways. And I think also on a personal level, it's given me so much of a better understanding. Many a times with what we do, we're very siloed, especially in our own mindset for getting certain things done, and we forget about the interactions within the organization. That itself could be a compliance issue, because acting on your own is not always the smartest thing. But having that understanding of a broader picture and how we work and what it actually means in our industry is very important. Next slide, please. So, knowing that you've been out there and you've gotten yourself certified, and you have that level of understanding, KOLs have actually reviewed this as a huge positive, and we see an overwhelming amount of them that actually believe and trust in the person they're working with. The actual compliance is something where it really matters at the end, right? Have we done Are we doing the right things? Are we following a more compliant manner? Are we reaching our KOLs in the proper way, offering the proper levels, reaching and taking care of their fair market value, the ability to interact with patients, all the things that are important to an organization that can get them in trouble. As you can see here, we've seen a 73% reduced risk, which at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, and there you will have it. So really, it's been able to do wonders, and I think it will continue to do wonders as more people enter our field and our industry and try and do the right thing. Number one, for the patients, but also maintain a certain standard for our industry, for the work that we do, and also for our reputation in the community. So, next slide. I think with that said, I've given my viewpoint on this, and so 2 outcomes really is, number one, learn, get trained, get certified, and number 2, make sure you have a Heather in your organization, because these are the people that are very important to keep us in line and make sure we don't do the wrong things out there. So those are my 2 cents, and I hope it was useful. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Sotirios. Thank you, Heather. A huge thank you to you both for sharing your expertise with us today. I believe that your insights were truly valuable. It looks like from the chat that they have also gained a lot of insights as well. Now, we've received some fantastic questions throughout the presentation. Now, we'll do our best to answer them as many of them as possible within the next about 15 minutes that we have. If you have any additional questions that haven't been addressed in the chat, please feel free to type them in now. All right. So I see a question here. How can I ensure that my team is completely compliant? One, rewatch this webinar. we had some really good insights, right? Especially for medical affairs, from start to finish, and engaging with HCPs, right? With education and training, Dr. Stergiopoulos went over BCMAS, the program, in order to certify your entire team. We also have at ACMA additional resources, right? Oftentimes, pharmaceutical companies, they will reach out to us to accredit their organization or some of their speaking sessions in order for us to review and ensure that they are remaining compliant, right? This is really a positive in the eyes of the government, because you took that initiative to have that external validation on compliance and remaining compliant.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Kiana.
It's assumption that for speakers events, medical affairs is responsible and not marketing for this process, since they are contracting and paying for promotional programs. So I think this was a question, Heather, when you were discussing the speaker program with Novartis, was this a medical affairs or marketing?
No. So Novartis was on the promotional side, but the concepts apply, to both marketing, med affairs, etc. So the egregious behavior was on the promotional side. And I don't know if the question also was asking, whether or not the engagement part would apply to med affairs or marketing, but it, generally it applies to all.
I agree. Absolutely agree.
How do you advise on training the HCP level?
So, that's an interesting question. The HCP level, if you're referring directly to the healthcare practitioners, most of the ones that are associated with work that is done with pharma industry are either from an academic setting, or they come from a setting that has individuals that also have compliance in their organization. Ideally, they need to also follow certain rules so they don't get banged up by, the authorities out there that are really looking at everything they're doing. I always found it interesting. Like I said, I came from a dinosaur era where we saw some real extreme things happening. And then all of a sudden one day, I remember asking a physician who I knew I had actually trained with them. I said, let me take you to lunch. He said, it can't be more than a certain amount of money. I was like, what are you talking about? This is someone I knew on a personal level. I says, well, because of the Sunshine Act. I said, wow, look at this, Sunshine Act. They even know. So they get trained about it as well. There is a certain fear level that they have now versus what it was in what they term as the good old days. There is a certain fear level because they know that it could really impact their work and what they do and their interactions. And they also could lose, their reputation. And if their integrity is really questioned out there, it becomes a bit of an issue when treating their patients. So it's funny how we'd like to also train them. I do think that every now and then, potentially reminding somebody of why we're saying we can only do this for them or why we can only invite them to so many meetings is a way of reinforcing maybe something they know, or at least providing them an explanation. And by such, I would say, educating them on what the limitations are. So, I think it's the worst thing you could do is not have an open discussion with your HCP when trying to look like you're hiding things and whatnot, or trying to bring a wrong image. It doesn't set a good relationship, number one. And it also tells them that you're not as interested about them as much as you should be, because in the long run, they become your partners in helping what you're trying to develop. So, Heather, you probably have some more to add to this as well.
Yeah, what I would just add is to keep in mind that the anti-kickback statute applies both ways. So it applies to the giver and the receiver. So if they are on, if you're not acting compliantly, there's the potential that, they are going to get dinged for your actions as well. And you want them to understand that. Most do, because most organizations, like you said, have their own training, but it does go both ways. And so it is in their best interest as well to do this and have it done correctly.
I'll tell you a funny story, though. I've been actually told by someone who we invited to a dinner, and he said, why don't we keep this really good? And I'll buy dinner because there's no limit on me buying you dinner the other way around. So I said, oh, that's great. At the end, we didn't have to go to Panera. We could have actually went to a real place to eat. So, every now and then there's a little bit of I would say humor in this as well. But, it gives you a good sense of the world that we're living.
And I can introduce here for the HCP training. We have at ACMA developed a training specifically for HCPs and KOLs. Right? Organizations can pass out or include their KOLs into the training so that they are abreast and they are having an understanding on the kickback statute and all of these regulations that are put in forth. So we have compliant interactions on both sides, right? The organization and medical affairs, as well as HCPs as well. So if this is something that you're interested in with that question, please feel free to reach out to us and I can send you more information on that KOL speaker training. What sort of training would be ideal for a medical affairs executive for self-development?
I mean, while dealing with the ACMA so many years, there's also tailored programs that are made that would allow for, what the medical affairs executive feels is lacking in their understanding of certain things. So I think there's multiple ways to go and approach this. And I think if just an open discussion with the ACMA, they would definitely be able to work out a program for training. And then, Kiana, you would probably answer that better than I would at this point.
Yes, of course, the BCMS program, this is not for only those looking to break into the industry. It is a board certification where you are becoming an expert in all things medical affairs, how to best work cross-functionally, right? Internally, these are those insights that you need, especially at the executive level, right? What team members or cross-functional colleagues you have that are important to further your strategy, how to build out your medical affairs strategy as well. All of this information is included in BCMAS.
Could have said it better myself.
Is there a formal course for medical compliance with the mention of relevant guidelines, etc.? Again, this is a subtle plug. The BCMAS program, again, we cover the compliance, regulations, relevant guidelines, no matter which region you are in, right? Heather mentioned that regulations vary depending on your region. At the ACMA, we have 10 international versions of BCMAS specific to 10 international regions, and the regulations accrediting their sections or their regions. So again, I will plug here BCMAS. We also have a program specifically on compliance if you're looking for something smaller or bite-sized that you can share with your team. I see consistent questions coming through of the presentation being reported, and you really like the insights, the workflows, the case study that was provided in our slides. Yes, the presentation is recorded. It will be shared to you via email along with the slides so that you can save those slides, save those workflows, that case study, and be able to share them as well. Does BCMAS ensure my medical team's alignment with compliance in pharma? Yes. We build our program when discussing compliance on pharmaceutical regulations. Whether you're in medical devices or in diagnostics, we cover those regulations in BCMAS. The pharma code, AVAMED that Heather mentioned, we cover those as well in the BCMAS program. What is the best way to get your foot in the door into the industry as a student or a recent grad from medical or pharmacy school? Any suggestions of internships or paths students can take? This is a long-winded question. I could really spend another hour answering this question. We actually have a couple of webinars that directly addresses this. You can take a look at our resources on our website, medicalaffairsspecialist.org, and we cover, you can rewatch those webinars and the resources that we provide to students looking to break into the industry. We are currently taking interviews for internships this summer, so feel free to reach out to me if you need more information. Alrighty. Thank you all for joining us today for this informative discussion on compliance and medical affairs. I see some other questions that have come into the chat specifically for our speakers that we don't have time to answer. Our emails, contact information, MedCompli, their information as well should be shared after the webinar, but feel free to reach out to us directly on LinkedIn or via our emails if you'd like for us to address any of your questions. I really hope that you found today's webinar valuable. Once again, thank you to our speakers and to all of you for attending. This webinar has now concluded. Have a great and wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.